and welcome to the last episode of this series podcast about the book that we've been discussing for the past episodes. Today's episode we'll be talking about the social origins of writing, the form tokens of text. The name of this episode will be Artifacts of Thought, that will explore the fascinating history of human ingenuity. Today, we're diving into the story of writing. Now, just as what you might expect, we're not going back to pens and papers, but the very roots of written communication, which surprisingly are intertwined and counting in commerce. Our journey begins with not with letters, but with numbers. Actually, archaeological Dennis groundbreaking work reveals that the development of writing wasn't an independent invention, but rather an outgrowing of a system of numerical notations. The earliest counting device weren't abstract numerals, but physical objects. Let's go back to talk about 15,000 years ago, when we noticed bones, when we find notched bones, and we noticed the first appearances of bones, and the first known cutting tools. These weren't used as abstract numbers, but rather to make comparisons between sets, each knot representing one item. This is a form of counting by enumeration, not by numbers. Even today, some communities such as Vedas in Sri Lanka use a similar approach to count. For them, the one pebble equals one item, like a coconut, like in the short musical translation. Fast forward to around 8,000 to 300 before Christ. It is what is now called Syria. This is where the story really takes off. Farmers developed small clay tokens, or calculi. Those tokens came in different shapes. This was sheep, old for jars of oil. Sheep was for measures of grain. Crucially, each type of good had its own token. These tokens were used to trade and to keep track of the good in temples and early city stages. For 5,000 years, this was a system. The tokens weren't just a means of record keeping, they were a form of communication, encountering precise information about specific quantities of goods. So everyone knew what a specific token would mean by trading in, for example, a sheep. Over time, those tokens became more complex to reflect the expanding range of good trade in society. Now, there's where things get a little bit more exciting, because to secure transactions, people began putting tokens into clay boule, which is hollow clay balls. But what is the problem, you ask? If you wanted to check what it was inside, you had to break it open. Around 3,500 years before Christ, a breakthrough was present. In Sumerian opposite to Syria, they began to impress the tokens on the outside of the veil before sealing them. No need to break the bulla. 200 years later, the tokens inside of the bulla become obsolete, and impressions of the clay boule became independent entities. Instead of simply replicating tokens, people began to use silicas to trace signs that actually mimic the complex shapes of the calculi. These instituted signs as direct representations of the tokens. But then something changed. People stopped repeating the sign for each item. Instead, they used numerical signs before the sign of the good. This marked the separation between quantity of the good and the beginning of abstract numbers. For example, 33 jars of oil could now be expressed by 7 signs instead of 33. The quest to record transactions eventually led to another leap, writing down people's names. Around 300 years before Christ, signs were used to represent the sounds of words, like first phonographs. The stylized picture of a man came to represent a man of Sumerian, and the picture of a mouth and the sound ka. This means that names could now be years before Christ in the court of the king of UR, or the purpose of writing expanded. A scribe began using a shovel of engraved gold and silver objects to tomes with names, such as Mescalam. This was the first time that writing was not used for accounting but for funeral rites. According to Denise Vesera, this practice was based on the Sumerian belief that the name of the deceased had to be spoken regularly for the soul to continue existing. For this long and willing history leads to an important conclusion. Numbers, writing, and money all emerge from the practice of managing and exchanging goods. Initially inseparable, they become distinct systems with their own functions, and what might at first appear as simple, practical, and functional actually evolved out to be a social practice and commercial and administration. The marks of the Sumerian tablets requested that the social practices in which they were used as the tokens, buildings, and tablets became more complex. They evolved according to the human intention of waiting to make it easier to record and secure transactions. Our sources purpose that artifacts have a social ontology. That is to say, objects with writing only make sense within human activities, like the exchange goods. The objects only function because people collectively attributed them to their purpose. John Searle's theory, for example, of social reality purpose, that there are three underlying phenomena: assigning the functions, collective intention, and designing status functions. These ideas can be extended to all human artifacts. The development of writing reflects how the intention of a communicator transformed a physical object into a symbol of truth. What began as a simple fact of counting sheets and jars of oil evolved into a complex system of symbols that can record not just as quantities, but names, histories, and entire cultures. From large bones to complex writing systems, the development of writing reveals the social, cognitive, and human dimensions of our collective human experience. So this is the end for episode 12. Thank you for joining us for the Artifacts of Thought. And thank you for an overall exploring this human innovation of how we can connect in the design world of the design of communication. We can conjoin the world between the human and the machine, making it more approachable for everyone and making it design a more approachable and usable world for everyone. So thank you so much for all of this time, this past 12 episodes, and